Welcome back to Beyond the Wrench. My name is Jay Goninen, and I am your host. Dan Paulson returns to talk about his new book, Escape the Owner's Trap. We're going to dig into what keeps shop owners stuck and how to build systems, develop leaders, and create a business that doesn't rely on you for everything. If you've ever felt like you can't step away, this one's for you. Dan, welcome back to the show. How are you?
Great, Jay. Thanks for having me back. It's wonderful to be here.
So, this book I'm really, really excited about. I believe just came out called Escape the Owner's Trap. Tell us a little bit about it.
Well, let me give you a little bit of backstory because this is a book that, so this is the second book I've written. The first book was many, many years ago, and there was always the idea of building a second book and building it more around kind of the systems that I help companies implement. And as I tell people, and as people tell me, there's always tomorrow, right? You know, you're too busy doing the stuff today. We can wait till tomorrow to get on that. And it's no different for me than it is for anyone else. Well, as I tell people, tomorrow came in a very hard way last year where, and you know this because, of course, we're connected beyond this, but I actually had a medical incident that took me out of work for quite a while. I spent a good chunk of May in and out of the hospital. I spent a good chunk of the month following that just trying to get back on my feet and recover from it. And, you know, even at that point, I realized that when the business completely revolves around me, things that happen then prevent other things from being done. And now I was a living example of what I was warning other companies about. So while I had time to sit here and ponder, you know, what I was going to do with my company going forward and how I was going to prevent this situation from ever happening to me again, the idea came back to the book. And the book being, you know, most owners, they start a company with this idea that's going to create freedom for them. And lo and behold, they're successful. They start creating that they start building that company, building that income. Growth happens. Employees come along. In your case, you know, the machine shop grows. There's more bays, there's more tax, there's more everything else, but that owner still controls everything. Everything goes through the owner. They're responsible for it. And over time, the freedom that they thought they were creating becomes the burden that holds them back. And they might reach certain plateaus in the growth of the business where maybe, you know, they reach a certain milestone in either financial or in operational that they just can't seem to overcome that hurdle. Or the second part of that is now they're getting to the age where they can't do the work anymore. They don't want to do the work anymore. Now they built some value in the business. They want to sell it. But when they start talking to those M&A guys, they start realizing that a lot of that value is tied up in them. They leave and they're getting replaced. You know, they're going to have to replace themselves with 3 or 4 other people at a pretty significant expense, which then lowers that valuation. Now it creates another problem that they've got to deal with. So I realized this was a problem, and I realized this was becoming a bigger problem, especially for those guys advancing in age who want to eventually get out of the company and retire, that they really needed structure in place. They needed to build discipline, and they needed to utilize a culture that actually helped them grow the business. And I looked at other systems out there. You know, I'm not going to mention all the different names, but there's a lot of other programs out there that I know many companies use, but they're very systems-based. And I will tell you, systems are a wonderful thing. They allow you to control everything in your organization to a certain extent and help guide others on how to do their job better and set KPIs that are manageable. But here's the other problem I've run into, where you try to implement the systems and maybe the employees haven't bought in yet. Maybe the owner hasn't bought in. So they invest all this money to get this better process going, and 3-4 months later, all of a sudden they've reverted back doing mostly what they were doing before at a pretty significant extent. So my approach has always been you start with culture first and build the systems after the culture is set, because you have to build the habits and you have to build the discipline before you can implement the systems successful. And that's really where the impetus of the book came about. Is the trap is you're stuck in doing what you do on a day-to-day basis. Everyone's coming to you for answers, and you, even when you try to implement the systems, it still falls back on your plate, and you can never seem to get over that hurdle. The book is really the guideline of how you build the culture first, build the discipline next, and then implement the systems following that.
Yeah, and it's It's a great way of going about it. And for those of you that probably don't know, most people probably don't know, we actually use Dan at our own independent repair shop here in Wisconsin. And a lot of what he's talking about are some of the things that we've had to go through with him in trying to get some of those habits changed, some of those behaviors changed. And it's a lot harder than it sounds, right? So many of us
Yes,
are
it is.
used to our day-to-day life, and at our shop, our family shop, I'm not there all that often. I can't be there very often. So we had to work around being able to get processes in place and kind of just our way of doing things. And when I talked to Dan initially, it was about some of the frustrations that I had with folks in our organization, really, really good ones that were struggling to follow processes. And so it probably, I was guilty, like everybody else is, Dan, of wanting to jump directly into the processes without really kind of looking at the behaviors that drive those processes in the first place. And so it took some learning on my end to truly kind of understand that there's more to it than just putting a process down on paper. And I think there are times in life where we have a tendency to overcomplicate things. I feel
Hmm.
like on the process side, we, and maybe this is just me being guilty of this, but almost oversimplifying the process of making processes, right? Where you think you're going to write it down, people are going to follow that process time and time out, time in and time out, and then get frustrated when that doesn't happen. Is that something that is just for us at our shop in Mineral Point, Wisconsin, or is that kind of something similar to what you see with other businesses as well?
Well, Jay, this should make you feel much, much better. It is not unique to you by any stretch of the imagination. Almost every company that I deal with goes through the exact same situation. They think if you implement these processes, they're automatically going to be followed to the letter of the law, and you'll never have to worry about them again. And right from there is some of the issue that's going on, because even, as you mentioned, I'm working with your shop. We've been talking about some of the procedures that your team already does, and how do we get those formalized to some degree. And of course, as I'm talking to them, they're like, well, you can do it this way, but then you can also do it this way, and this way. I'm like, whoa, whoa, whoa. First of all, we're getting too far in the weeds. Yes, you can probably do it a multitude of different ways, but this is the problem we run into. We try to create every avenue without worrying about how first do we get from point A to point B in the most simplest way. And then as we go on, if we want to go to a more, I'll call it advanced route, then we can do that, but that's a different step along the way. And yeah, everyone thinks that, oh, if I just implement the system, or if I just implement the process, it'll be followed. But you know what? Guys on the floor, gals on the floor, they figure out ways to cheat the system. And we're all guilty of this. So I'm guilty of this. Jay, I can almost guarantee you've probably done this sometimes.
100%.
You look for the shortcut. You look for the shortcut, or you know the shortcut. But sometimes the shortcut also erodes the process. And the more shortcuts you create, and usually the shortcuts come in where there's a problem. And the system that was designed doesn't address the problem that came into play. Now, I'm not a shop owner, so I can't speak to the technical side of things. But let's just say, you're doing a repair job on a car, and the technology that you're using for whatever reason isn't working the way it should. Well, the tech there has to figure out how to make the fix happen. They might know of a technique that works that isn't written into your process, so they then cheat the system. I tend to see this more on like manufacturing and even service-based industries, service-based especially, where there isn't anything formally documented, or there isn't anything tangible that it's a lot easier to work around. So then they'll modify the process to fix the problem. Well, okay, that's fine maybe for that one situation, but then they never formalize that in a documentation setting, nor do they make anyone else aware of it. And then what you see happen over time is, well, I got away with that fix. I'm going to do the next one, the next one. Pretty soon, often in weeks or months, the system that you put in place is no longer followed anymore.
Yeah.
So as part of creating the process, you have to create the process first in the most simplest linear fashion that you can. And then from there, already set up a formalized follow-up that you're going to hold people accountable to. And that's the part that's often missing. because they think once you put that system in place and once you document that system, you're done. And nobody ever comes back to it again. And I can pretty much say nobody, because there's never usually a cadence set up where, okay, we're going to review things, at least do a touch base once every month, once every quarter. It doesn't have to be that often. It doesn't have to be that long. But we should be looking back and say, has anything changed? And Jay, you know this, and you guys use Techmetrics. I'm going to mention that name just simply because we got a reference here. But like any software out there, any software I use, in fact, if we were trying to log in and get this done, new software, everything's laid out differently. Software almost always every month changes something because they have to feel like they're advancing, their UI experience, user interface experience. And so the button that's over here is now over there. Well, if there's too many radical changes, now your process has to change. Nobody documents it within a matter of months or a year. Any text situations could be completely obsolete if you aren't putting in a regular cadence to review and update that over time.
So it's funny because I think when you've really dissected that really well, and throughout the book you have really done a nice job going through your process as well. And a lot of times I think people think about the hard hitting stuff that we need a process for, and I'll kind of go back to sometimes it's more of the simple stuff in that for us it was one of the major pain points and frustrations was verifying customer information. So when a customer would come in, and being in a small town, you kind of know everybody. So you really assume that their information is the same and hasn't changed. And so what would happen was kind of this cycle where our office staff would just get really frustrated because maybe they had a wrong phone number in, or they are mailing something to the wrong mailing address. And so something that is perceived as so simple, and we see it every day in a doctor's office, in a dentist office, and anywhere, the dentist specifically, I was just there, being able to, they do it just so naturally, and they have that process down. And so what seems really, really simple to them is actually pretty hard for us, right? Because this is something that is it's a new thing. It's something that I think we looked at what a desired outcome is. And that's where I think when I brought you in, it was like, okay, help us get to this desired outcome of getting verified customer information, something simple, or we'd think is simple, not so simple. So I think that's where when you came in and started looking at kind of the different behaviors, really kind of getting to know the key players at the shop. And then, you did a lot of advanced stuff ahead of just making processes. And I'm imagining that's because you want this to be a change that is, implemented for a long time. And if it's something that where technology does change the way that we go about that, or something else happens, that we can adapt as we go. We just have to keep a process fresh and kind of top of mind in hopes that it's actually going to take shape.
Yeah, well, and if we just take a look at your situation, for example, and again, your situation is not unique. I'm talking with other companies about this too. It all ties back to behavior. So it's not that the process is always broken; it's that the behavior doesn't align. So let's take the example of when you go to the dentist or you go to the doctor. It is so routine that they will ask for your name, your birth date, your social security, whatever information they're looking to collect. And as I mentioned in my medical incident, I could go into the hospital and I would get asked my last name and my birth date routinely over the course of an hour, multiple times. Because every time somebody new came in, okay, what's your last name, what's your birth date? Because they're confirming information. And keep in mind, they're doing that because it's been inbred in them that if you give somebody the wrong medication or if you give them the wrong procedure, you could kill somebody. Now, in the world of automotive, I would say there's probably some situations where that might be the case, but it's probably not the same when somebody's getting oil change or tire rotation or whatever. So it's not necessarily a habit that they're used to doing. Also, I know your people, and Jay, you got a lot of good people there, and they want to do the right things by their customers coming in the door, and especially when it's a small shop and people are in a hurry to get in and get out. And you see that line of people. I've worked in retail. When there's a line of people behind you, you want to move that line along as quickly as possible because you see the people tapping their feet and kind of getting that frustrated look because they want to get on to what they're doing. That's where the shortcuts start coming in. And if you don't have the discipline to follow through or don't know how to handle a situation like that, that's where the shortcuts tend to pop up. And as I was talking with your people, that was, again, they're trying to do the right thing, but they didn't know how to handle when there's 2 or 3 people in line. So we just looked at a couple cues that they could do just to acknowledge the individuals that are behind them and then get back on track. Another thing that we did to help them out, really simple. So, you were talking about simplicity versus complexity. I would say most processes are simple, but they're not easy. And that's the differentiator, because we can make a simple process, but if nobody follows the process because of either past behaviors or because of other things that get in the way, that's really where we start running into problems. So we put in place just a basic checklist right by the iPad or the computer there, and started coaching your people to just, hey, before you let them go, look at the list. Can you mentally check off everything that they did? Now, were they perfect out of the gate? No, but that's also where, again, we have to have that routine. So now the leaders have to have the discipline to come back and say, hey, did you do this? Or when we make that mistake, hey, what did we miss this time? How do we make sure we correct that so that they know there's eyes on it, they know there's people watching it? Because I will tell you from personal experience, the more you watch something or the more you hold people accountable to it, the more likely that system to be followed. And that's often what's missing. I know this because you and I grew up in a different time, and probably more me than you actually, because I think I got you by the elbow. But, you were told to do something once and you were expected to do it. And I find a lot of people, especially in their 50s and 60s, that kind of grew up with that mindset. I told you what to do. I expect you to do it. There shouldn't be this huge discussion on the end. And what I tell people is when you look at our generations now, you go back to the millennials, Generation X, Generation, what is it, Z now, and I think it's Generation Alpha. So we've got, beyond the X's that are now leaving the marketplace, we've got 3 other generations that come in. And I tell people, when you look at it, if you had kids, and I know you have kids, and I often ask other people, do you have kids? Okay, you have kids. What do you have them do pretty much from the time they can start walking? Well, they're in soccer, or they're in basketball, or they're in karate, or they're in some form of activity where there's somebody always coaching. What happens though when they get into the workforce? Well, they're expected to do the job without any coaching. Well, what do they want? You talk to any of these generations, they want coaching, they want feedback, they want to know that what they're doing matters and what they're doing is a good job. They're not getting that anymore. So here's the breakdown. I know you've talked about this because I've listened to your podcast. If you're not giving that feedback back to that individual and then holding them accountable to that feedback and focusing on the positive things, it's going to be very hard to keep that employee engaged and keep them employed by you because they'll go somewhere else where they can find that. And that's really what it is about building in the systems, is you can have the best system in the world, but if you don't have the behaviors behind it, it doesn't matter how good that system is because nobody's going to follow it.
Yeah, and that was I remember first starting off with you, and I had known you for many years prior to engaging in this work with you, but I thought it was really interesting in that you were really intentional about driving communication early, right? In
Mm-hmm.
making sure a daily huddle was a part of what you were doing. And I think when we look at, like, we just had our voice of technician survey come back, and you still see a common thread with automotive and diesel shops in that there's still a large gap in communication. And I think so many of us talk about communication and think it's simpler than what it really is. It is hard
Mm-hmm.
to do. And I think having something as simple as a structured daily huddle to touch base and make sure that things are being communicated, rather than maybe a leader getting frustrated because their people aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing, or the employee being frustrated because they're not being properly communicated to. There's just a lot of this not not just our shop, but any business probably, but shop
Yeah.
specifically, where there are a large number of communication breakdowns. And I feel like that drives angst. I think it drives miscommunication. I think it drives
Yep.
so many negatives that it might seem at times for I've heard leaders talk about this in the past where they want to cut down on meetings. They don't want meetings. They want as few meetings as possible. But you almost do that to a detriment of your organization because things aren't getting clearly communicated, and there's not maybe that feedback of understanding as well, right? Where if you're
Hmm.
doing a daily huddle real time and can really be able to understand that piece of it, that there's confirmation that you understand what I'm telling you, and if there's not, I want you to be able to ask that question back to me. I think there was a lot of power in that part alone of really pushing that and not have it be like a haha, like, oh, by the way, we're doing this, but like an actual structured daily stand up of these are the items that are important to us and this is what we're going to focus on. That communication strategy and style, I think, is so important for any business, let alone shops.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because I agree with you. I'm not a big fan of meetings, but it's not the meeting itself is having meaningful meetings. And I think where most owners get frustrated and feel they have too many meetings is the meetings aren't structured. We've talked about this. The meeting has to have an agenda, it has to have an outcome, and it has to have a timeline. So, for example, the daily huddles you brought up. And I've coached these guys and anyone else. A morning huddle is 10 to 15 minutes, period. You do not get off on tangents. You do not talk about things that are unrelated or bring up problems that can't be solved in that meeting, because the whole point of that meeting is to really kind of structure your day and maybe into tomorrow, depending upon the nature of your job and what you're doing. By doing that, that limits the amount of time that you can talk about, which is also why it's important to follow an agenda. Most meetings do not have an agenda, which is what allows them to go off in any particular direction and really frustrate people immensely, because now we're talking about everything from what the kids are doing this weekend to, hey, Joe Bob had this problem over here, but it's not anything, again, you can solve that day. It might be important, but it's not for that meeting. So that needs to be tabled and then brought back at a later date when it doesn't matter. And then it's that outcome. What's the outcome of that daily huddle? Well, it's what's going on in the shop that day. Who's coming in? What are we dealing with? Is there something on the rack, for example, that, hey, we thought this was going to be a 1 hour fix. All of a sudden we found this other problem. We got permission from the owner. Now it's going to be on the rack for 8 hours. Well, that's a completely different situation than what you're planning, and that's also backlogging other work that you might have that you need to use that rack for. So there's a lot of things going on that changes throughout the course of the day or the week, and if that is never dealt with, the techs out in the shop have no clue what's going on other than what's put in front of them. The people that are at the desk trying to figure out how to play the shell game and move these vehicles around and take care of the customers, that's not addressed. So there's a lot of confusion that goes on. And I think that's what leads to a lot of the issues. And then you factor that in. Okay, now you're trying to have me have another meeting, but now this meeting's going to stretch out to be an hour. That's where people really don't want to deal with it anymore. So it's getting that discipline. It all goes back to, again, culture and discipline. Start there. Build that in first. Then you have meaningful meetings. Well, how do you have meaningful meetings? Again, they're very structured. There's an agenda, there's an outcome, and there's a timeline to it. And you figure out that cadence and you work with that cadence to make sure that sticks. Once you do that, then you can start adding more to it. But just having more meetings for the sake of having more meetings, I've worked for large companies. And I will tell you, the main problem with a multi-billion-dollar company is they are not afraid to have more meetings, and they will tie up hours, if not days, to discuss a problem that they will never solve because they'll kick it to another meeting. And that's where I lived my life in corporate America, which is also another reason why I got out of corporate America.
Every shop, dealership, and business in our industry depends on great technicians. Between the technician shortage, disconnected school relationships, and lack of trustworthy workforce data, it makes it difficult for shops to plan, hire, and grow. That's where ASE Connects comes in. Created in partnership with WrenchWay, ASE Connects is a membership designed specifically for shops like yours to help you build a stronger technician pipeline by connecting with schools, empowering you with tools and data to improve your recruiting, retention, and performance. With ASE Connects, you can connect with local schools through School Assist, start building relationships, and support the programs that educate our future technicians. You can also access verified data on technician pay, benefits, and labor rates through the Industry Data Exchange so you know how your shop compares locally and nationally. Lastly, you can get proven strategies for leadership, employee development, and shop management through members-only guides, templates, and events. Join ASE Connects to strengthen your workforce and build a stronger, smarter shop. Learn more at wrenchway.com/solutions/shops or follow the link in the show notes. So in talking about those meetings, one thing I'd like to ask you about is the accountability piece. So
Sure.
You talk about holding people accountable. I think this is something that a lot of leaders struggle with because a lot of us don't feel like we want to be babysitting. We don't feel like we want to be micromanaging, if you will. Any advice in maybe those meetings or otherwise on accountability?
Yeah, I agree with you. Nobody wants to be the micromanager, and that when I talk to a business owner, it's usually their biggest frustration, and that's why they often say, "I told them what to do. I should not have to come back and remind them, nor should I have to come back and check up on it." Well, then they're surprised when what they come back to isn't what they wanted. So something's missing there, and that's where I think where people misunderstand what accountability is. Accountability isn't micromanagement. It is simply making sure that there's a complete understanding of what's expected, what jobs to be done, and ultimately somebody to stand there or not stand there. I don't want to, you're not lording over anybody, but you're coming back and you're making sure that what was agreed upon is getting done in the timeline. Now, what does that do over a period of time? And one thing we haven't talked about is values. And I know that's something that we've kind of worked on at a very high level in your shop. But we set at least 3 main objectives. And I wouldn't call these values, but we set some guidelines. One was accurate information. One was, I called it expediting the customer experience, making sure you're taking care of that customer and getting them in and out quickly and efficiently as possible. And there's a third one. Jay, help me out. Do you remember what it is? I'm going to put you on the spot now.
We had some with communication between the front office staff.
Yep. That's the third one.
Yep. So verifying customer information. Yeah, exactly. Yep. That was the one.
Yep. So in the situation that I came into, there was 2 people in the front office, and they were kind of communicating, but not really. And that's really where the morning huddles came, because we needed to figure out how to kind of repair the communication between those 2 individuals and get an understanding of it. And from what I'm aware of, that's improved greatly, and that's solved a lot of the issues, which then led to the whole,
has.
Yeah, that led to the whole. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Well, the weird thing with that, and I think these guys would say it as well, was it wasn't even necessarily negative. It wasn't a negative relationship. It was just kind of, there was some barrier there to where we were missing some of that communication, and one, just acknowledging it and like kind of sharing. I think you did a really good job of just hitting that between the eyes, right? Like this is the issue that we're having. We need to be able to address this and do this differently. And it just was, it's a candid talk, a candid conversation that I think was needed up front to be able to really just talk about, right? And say, what can we do better?
Well, and a key part of that was who owns it. I was actually having this discussion yesterday with the client, because there is this misunderstanding of who owns the action. Most employees push the ownership up to the leadership team. So if that's the case, for example, Jay, if you're the shop owner and I'm the employee and you tell me to do something, I'm doing whatever I can to push that work back up to you. And this is a natural occurrence. This is not a blame game on anybody, but we all work on the easiest route or the path least So, for example, if I'm unsure about something, I will often go talk to the boss. This is what I see happen in companies. They go talk to the boss provides them with an answer or solution, they go back and they implement the solution. What you need to understand behaviorally is what that creates is that creates a dependency of that owner to solve the employee's problem. The problem's never put back on the employee for them to solve it themselves. This is where accountability is different. And if you're, instead of when that employee comes to you and comes to you with a problem, if you're pushing it back on and asking them for a solution, it's forcing them to kind of solve their own issues. And over time, if you do that often enough, they start to figure out that they have to, before they come to you, they have to have a solution in place. And eventually it gets to the point where they understand what the solution needs to be and they can just act on that immediately. A lot of that, again, is tied to values. Companies talk about mission, vision, values all the time. Strategic planning is all built around that. And I will tell you the most important thing is the thing that is least done, which is really dealing with the values. Because in my opinion, values target what you will do and what you won't do to create the certain customer experience or the certain product that you're looking to push out. And if people don't understand what the values are, and how those guide decision making, it's very hard to get an employee to make the right choices, which then leads to the micromanagement from the owner. And that's where it really is kind of crafting. What are those 3, no more than 5 core values? And those core values really turn into more value statements that are then supported by stories that show where those values have been positively enacted in your organization. It's a longer step than just a quick snap of the fingers and implementing systems. And this is, again, why I wrote the book and where I found the problem with most other processes out there is they're so quick to go to the systems and that's going to solve everything. It doesn't. It really relies on building the right behaviors in place. If you don't have those core values tied in, and if people don't understand what those values mean and how they work, and they aren't implemented in every conversation you have, it's going to be very hard to get your employees to do the right things, even when you direct them to. Because if there's an opportunity to take a shortcut, again, natural behavior, not blaming anyone, it's going to naturally happen. It's just going to occur. It doesn't occur, though, when they know there's a barrier on either side. And I describe it. So here's an automotive analogy, and I'm a race car guy, so this is what I look at. You think of your company as a multi-lane highway, and your people are going down this on a one-lane road, but there's multiple lanes. And the reason there's multiple lanes is there's going to be obstacles in front of you. Problems come up, fires pop up. You need to be able to maneuver around those situations. At the same point, there needs to be guardrails, because the guardrails are what keep you on the road. Those are your values. If you have no values, there's no guardrails. Well, what happens then? Well, you're going to go off into the ditch because somebody's going to make a decision or do something that is going to either damage your reputation, damage your equipment, or damage your customer's equipment, in this case, maybe their car. So you got to do things to protect yourself. And that's really where a lot of this stuff comes into play. And it takes longer to implement that. And we're in a habit now society, and that's probably the biggest challenge I have, is, you look at the systems that we've been working on. And it wasn't day one we were putting things in place. It was more like week 4 before we even really started implementing anything that I would say was seriously process related. There were some basic stuff. For example, starting the day. What do you do at the beginning of the day to basically open up the shop? What do you do at the end of the day to close the shop? Is there anywhere that's documented what procedures or what steps you're going to follow? Well, there wasn't. So we created a checklist. And then, of course, the concern was, well, nobody's going to follow the checklist. Well, the reason nobody follows the checklist is nobody checks up to see if the checklist is used. I put the ownership on them to say, okay, how are we going to make sure this checklist is done? And they thought about it, and they said, well, for one thing, we'll hang the checklist by the back door, so right when we come in, that's the first thing we can grab. Good decision. Let's go ahead and implement that. They went, they got a way to hang it up. How else can we do this? Well, we'll keep the checklist, we'll put it on a laminated sheet of paper, and we'll have a dry erase marker so that we can check off, so we can use that. We'll have the opening on one side, we'll have the closing on the other. As we go through and we do our opening, we check it off. We then leave the checklist between the desks, between the two office managers there. At the end of the day, somebody grabs that checklist and they basically reverse the process, going all the way back out the door, checking off the closing procedures, hang it by the door. Everything's done. At any point, Jay, you can come in and you should be able to look at that list during the day, see what they checked off. At the end of the day, see what was done at the end of the day, and hopefully, again, that checklist completed and hanging by the door. Was it perfect the first go around? I think you and I would agree there was times that they were phoning it in and it wasn't getting done. But what both you and I did was we would come back and say, hey, where's that checklist? And when I come in, one of the first things I look at is where that checklist is supposed to be sitting and make sure it's consistent. The first couple times, I'd ask about it. Hey, is it getting done? And one person would say, oh, yeah, it was getting done. And the other person would kind of look at me and give me that sheepish grin. It's like, well, we didn't do it today. Okay, well, instead of yelling at them, it was just, what are we going to do to make sure that this is done? Do we understand why it's important? Because I think that's the other thing that's often missed.
Yes.
Why are we doing this? It's not to help you out per se, but we know that checklist does help them out because you get busy, I get busy, we skip steps because, again, as you're racing along, you're trying to get everything done, but you might miss that important step. You might miss, for example, in this situation, they might miss locking the back door for hours, or they might miss turning off a light or turning off a compressor because we're in a hurry. And that's just a natural part of things. The whole point of the checklist is just, did we go through, did we do everything? And that's what helps. But to me, the more important thing, and you just recently hired a new individual, is now we have a training tool. Now when that person comes in, we can show them and we can walk them through it because the way we learn is through seeing, hearing, and doing. Now we have the tools that allow us to do all three of those things. The checklist is part of the seeing and doing part. Now as you're walking them through, okay, this is what this is. Now you're showing them. All that stuff is done. The other thing we've also implemented, or we're starting to implement now, is video, because all of us are walking around with video cameras in our pockets, and we can record these things. And now we've got training tools that we can change on the fly at very low cost. Both you and I, Jay, have worked for large corporations where they'll bring in they would bring in a video crew, or they would do all this stuff, and then of course, a couple months later, it's all outdated. But now you can do this stuff on a camera on your phone, so we can update it on the fly at almost any given point in time. So now it's just creating the routine where we're reviewing that over time. But technology has freed us up a lot more to make these changes happen. But that's where you put in the discipline and where you put in the check. And then over time, being the reinforcement, just saying, hey, did you do that? Oh, no, you didn't do that. Okay, what are we going to do to make sure it happens next time? I don't own it, you own it. So that comes back to who owns what. And that's what becomes so critical and gets you away from that micromanagement.
Yeah, and it's so interesting. And as you were talking through your values, I go back. I think I've got a book up here as I'm turning away from the microphone. I do. It's called Principles by Ray Dalio, and he took to a whole different level where he had built. This is, I don't know, 10 years ago, had built an algorithm to help people understand how he made decisions so that they could, he took it to that extent to try and get people to understand what his thought process was to make decisions in the hopes that his people could start to make their own decisions. So I love that part of it. And then, I think the part that we talked about earlier that I think is really, really important was the really deciding what was important to us as a shop,
right,
as a business, and clearly identifying, for us, it was those top three things, and then having conversations with them over and over and over about those three things and asking them what those three things were, and kind of just really getting it ingrained in their brain. And I'll never forget, early on, you had said something about you're going to get to the point to where you've talked about it so much that they're going to start rolling their eyes. And it was very much the truth, right? Where it does get to that point, but you're trying to change the way they think about some of this, and trying to rewire their brain and really look at identifying those top priorities and making them top of mind so that they don't get forgotten about it. And something as simple as verifying customer information, it's easy to talk about, hard to do. And unless we're talking about how much that means to us as a company kind of over and over and over again, it's really hard. And we got to the point to where, Matt on our team, Matt
Yep.
came up and said, I was down there late one afternoon and I said, how's this coming along? And again, I'm not there all the time. I'm not there very often. And so I go down and was talking to him, just asked, how's this coming along? And he said, I finally come to the conclusion that we have to do this for every single customer that comes in. Otherwise, we're not going to do it at all. And so he changed his mindset on the frequency that they needed to do
Mm-hmm.
it. And it wasn't me kind of putting it on a platter for him to tell me that
Yep.
what I wanted to hear. It was more of him kind of coming to that conclusion on his own that, hey, you know what? If we're going to truly make a change here and we're truly going to make this better, we have to be consistent. We have to do this with everybody. And they'll still get tripped up from time to time, but it
Mm-hmm.
is far better than what it ever was before.
Yep.
And it is top of mind for them, right? And we're talking about it every day. And even if I'm not down there, shooting Slack messages back and forth to each other about making sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. So
Yep.
it is, I think, importance of understanding what you want first and foremost, and then kind of reaffirming that every single day and making sure that that's talked about. That's been really powerful.
Yeah, and what you just described there is really the tipping point where the ownership moves from the leader to the team. And that's really what you want. That's what makes a successful company and allows a company to scale. Is once the team owns the problem or owns the challenge, then the solution's going to come about. And I'm glad to hear that Matt stated that, because that, for the first couple weeks, couple months, there was some pushback on that to some degree, because it's like, well, we know who these people are. As you point out, you're in a small town. Everybody's related to everybody. I grew up in a small town myself, so it's like, you don't date anyone because you're probably a cousin to them. But yeah, everybody, so you assume, again, emails don't change, phone numbers don't change, addresses don't change. But the reality is, even your third cousin once removed might move across town and live in a different house or a different apartment, and you just don't, because you made that assumption. Now all of a sudden, all the information is wrong, and that's what often happens in organizations. We talk about it from we're talking about here from a customer standpoint, but there's stuff that happens in companies that, again, assumptions are made, and those assumptions, in some cases they're not terrible and they're benign. They're not going to take down the organization, but other assumptions sometimes are much more costly and much more problematic because the discipline has to be built in. And once you get to a point, again, where the employees own it and the leadership doesn't, the leadership just has to follow up. It's no longer micromanagement. It's just checking in to make sure we're still on target and still on task for what we need to
do. This week's episode of Beyond the Wrench is brought to us by Jasper Engines and Transmissions. Okay, your customer's engine or transmission has failed, but now is not the time for them to trade their vehicle. Not without a working engine or transmission. Besides, would they have kept their vehicle another 3 to 5 years if their engine or transmission had not let them down? If you answered yes, then Jasper Engines and Transmissions is your choice to give your customer's vehicle new life and many thousands of miles of enjoyable driving performance. When considering the high cost of a new or newer used vehicle, there's a pretty good case to be made for replacing a drivetrain component that has failed or is delivering poor performance. Rather than trading their car, truck, van, or SUV, install a quality remanufactured Jasper product for less than your customer would have to invest in a new vehicle or a newer used vehicle. Check out their website at jasperengines.com to learn more about the money-saving value of Jasper. It's been such a fun process to go through with you in trying to really get our hands around this. As we have gone through this, really talking about those behaviors, your book does a phenomenal job at talking through all of this. One of the things that I think is funny, and going back to what I said earlier about how we assume it's so simple, or maybe we're it's in elements we think it's too simple, in other elements we think it's too complex. But then when you look at something that, I think when you talk about the actual making of processes and how you come up with processes, that is where we oversimplify how easy it is to make a process and how easy it is to actually execute on a process consistently. Any advice to business leaders out there that are trying to come up with processes? And I think the easy thing to do right now is to type something in the chat GPT and have it try to spit out a process for you, right? Like, and
And
it's
half the
not,
time it's wrong.
and half the time probably more than that, right? And then you can
Yeah.
refine it and get it to where you need it to be. But I do think in every business I've ever been in, that is where it gets stale really fast. It's maybe not
Mm-hmm.
even accurate to start off with. This is pre chat GPT times where you would sit down, spend a little bit of time writing out processes, and then talk about it with your team maybe once. And then all of a sudden, you think you've got this process. And a lot of business books make it sound like it's really easy to just write up a process and have it
Yep.
executed. And you better follow my process this way. And then that goes back to what you were talking about with maybe even the generational gaps of writing out a process and then becoming very, very frustrated when nobody follows that process. And some of
Yep.
those processes I look at in a retail environment, it can be really challenging to follow a process unless you know it
Mm-hmm.
like the back of your hand. Because if you're answering the phone and the other two lines are ringing at the same time and you're like, oh no, I've got to follow this process, and you're trying to fumble around and find the process of which you're
Yep.
doing it, what happens then? It just falls apart, and you're not going to follow the process, and you're going to do whatever you need to do to get the customers taken care of. Any advice for those business leaders out there as it relates to developing processes and maybe trying to get them executed?
Yeah, there's a number of things you can do. Workflow is key to a lot of this. So where does the work go? You've probably seen flowcharts, and maybe some of your listeners have seen flowcharts or created flowcharts. It's often used in the IT world, but I've used it a lot, in the management world. We haven't really got into that with what you're doing, because a lot of the processes that we are working on right now are just the simple, basic ones. They're more the daily ones. In my opinion, the daily ones, because they're used so often, can be very simplistic in a lot of ways, because you have that muscle memory that develops because you're doing this all the time. The bigger issues come along are the processes that might be done once a month, once every 6 months, once a year, once every 5 years. Those are the ones that don't get talked about, reviewed, or documented. And then people change. Somebody might quit, and then somebody new gets hired in, but they're not hired in when that process needs to be done. Now 2 years goes by, and all of a sudden, again, this form needs to be filled out, or this procedure needs to be done, this compliance issue needs to be addressed. Those are the things that typically aren't documented clearly or at all, and then you're expecting somebody to fumble through it. Well, now what should take them maybe minutes or hours now takes them possibly days or weeks, because they have to go through and they have to figure out. But then it's never documented again. So now we're back in the same situation where another 5 years are going to go by, and that's never done. So from the standpoint of how you go about documenting processes, simple is better whenever possible. Linear path. Don't come up with all the ifs, ands, whats, or therefores. That comes at a later date. Just how do I get from where I'm at now to the result that I need in the quickest, most simplest way possible? And then we can, as they develop the skills for that, we can add on more. And that's really kind of where we're at with your team in a lot of ways. So it's building that simplified process. Whenever you can, visualize that process as much as possible. Like I talked about earlier, you need to see it, hear it, do it. We all learn differently. Some people can just observe something and they can immediately repeat it afterwards, because the way their brain works, they can see what's going on and their brain puts together how that happens. Other people need to do it. They need to touch it. They need to feel it. They need to walk through it, and then they build that muscle memory that way. Other people you can just walk through the process verbally, and they can follow along because they can visualize in their head what you're saying. If you incorporate all three of those concepts into whatever you're teaching, training, or whatever process you're creating, more than likely you're going to create a very sound process that's going to last for a long period of time. The next step then, as we talked about, is there's got to be some semi-formal review of that process over a specific period of time. Personally, I recommend at least looking once a quarter once you have them firmly established. In some processes, though, especially when it's technology and it's technology you don't own that somebody else is going to constantly be updating and changing, it might be once a month. And it's just a quick review to see, did they move these buttons or did they now hide this function that was right in front of you in a menu and is 3 layers deep now to go get that same thing done. You just have to create that cadence and that review, and that means put it on the calendar. Schedule the people that need to be there. You do not invite the whole team. You invite the team that's going to be influential on making that process happen. Because if you invite everyone in, there's going to be 3/4 of the people that are going to be standing around twiddling their thumbs going, I got better things to do, and you just bored the crap out of me. I'm not even paying attention anyway. So why bring them into the room? We think it's better communication. It's really not. Bring the people that it's going to matter. Get those processes documented. Get them recorded. Get some video out there. As you're doing the video, have somebody explaining what's actually going on in that video. We're using Zoom, for example, using things like tech metrics where we can see on the screen where that cursor is going, what they're clicking on, and then in this case, Matt is, I'm clicking on this because this does this function, and that opens up this menu, and then we enter this information here, and this is the information we should have, and then we close it out on this menu, and then it goes over here. And that's, I'm sitting here explaining through this. If people are listening to this, they have no clue what and we're not looking at anything anyway. But that's just, as you're visualizing what's happening in front of you, somebody is telling you what's actually going on and the why behind it. Why are we doing this? So back to the example of, when we need that accurate information. Why do we need that accurate information? Well, it's because people move, people buy new cars, people change vehicles, people might have multiple vehicles. You want to make sure you're doing everything right, so it's a one and done situation. You're not caught with your hands tied behind your back because somebody didn't check things. I'll give you an automotive example. So Jay, I'm a Corvette guy. I was taking my new Corvette into the dealership, and my new Corvette requires some very specific parts for it. Well, even for an oil change and for a transmission fluid change, it needed some specific filters. Well, guess what? The parts manager just assumed that it was going to be the same as the base car. It was not. So guess what? I drove an hour to the dealership expecting to have my oil changed and my transmission filter changed, only to find out that he comes out 10 minutes later, yeah, I didn't order the parts because I just assumed everything was right. I now had an hour drive back home and now had to reschedule an appointment. Well, I was busy traveling, so now I put an extra couple thousand miles on the car that I didn't want to do because they didn't have the right parts supply. That's what making that mistake happens. You tell that story to somebody who's handling that problem, and now they're going, oh, I get it. Now I understand why I need to do the checks and balances and make sure things are correct. That's just what we got to get to, is where people understand the impact it has not only on them internally, because now you've tied up a text time, you've wasted a text time that you're not going to be able to bill for because they can't bill until I come back and get the service work done. You wasted my time as a client, which has now upset me greatly because now I have to waste 2 trips and plus time that could damage my vehicle. You waste the shop money, which cuts into profit. So there's a lot of different things that impact it. And it's just getting to the point where you're communicating that to people and they start understanding it from their perspective on how it impacts not only the shop, but the customers as a whole.
What happens when maybe there's not agreement on the process itself? You talked about how we want that linear path, but oftentimes you'll have, if you've got a team, multiple people doing the same thing differently, right? And they might have arguments as to why they're doing it a certain way, and so might the other parties. And so trying to get consensus on this is the way we're going to do this moving forward. Any advice on that piece of process writing?
Well, I think it's real easy as the owner to say it's my way or the highway. And in my case, even if I don't necessarily agree with their process, I will ask questions and I will get their feedback because, as I mentioned earlier, people want to be heard. They want to feel like they have purpose and they want to know what they do matters. Well, if they have an idea or they think there's a better way to do it, shouldn't we at least take a little bit of time and hear them out? Because who knows, maybe what we've got in our head isn't the best way to do it. Maybe they do have a better and maybe we should listen to that. So we got to at least, give them the time of day and listen thoughtfully to what they're saying. And then if we're still not in agreement, we still have reasons why, we need to do things a certain way versus what they do. And we even went through this with your team. It's just asking them questions, saying, well, tell me more about that. Or, well, what if this happens? So I tell people I'm like Jeopardy. Everything's answered in the form of a question with me. I'm not always going to give you the statement. I'm going to use your brain matter to help solve the problem. So, okay, you're so insistent on this. Well, what if X is the outcome of that? How are you going to deal with that when Y is actually a better solution for that? Or tell me why Y is not going to be the solution, or why Y is not going to work. And then let's get an understanding of what you're seeing through your lens, and maybe then I can help reshape your lens to see why your solution is flawed. So it's that back and forth discussion that often doesn't happen. And again, I see this with a lot of people who are in their 50s and 60s who are very used to saying, no, this is the way you're going to do it, and just do it. Well, guess what? They go out and they'll tell you, they'll nod their head in agreement, and then they'll still go back and do whatever they feel is the right way. And it's probably not the way you want it.
Oh my goodness. You and I could talk about this for a long time.
Yes,
I think, and we do talk about this a lot. And I think for those that are interested, where do they get your book at?
Well, the easiest way right now, I would send them to Amazon, because you can get it in hardcover, you can get it in paperback, and you can also get the Kindle version if you want it. Haven't got to audio yet. We'll work on that in the near future.
You going to read it?
I am not going to read it. So
no? Oh,
no,
man.
Part of the whole medical thing that I had happen was it makes it concentrating on print and then reading it like we're talking here, this ain't going to happen. We'll just leave it at that.
Yeah.
But yeah, we'll get somebody to read it, or maybe here's where we use AI to fill in stuff. But the book is called Escape the Owner's Trap. It is really targeted not only towards owners, but really kind of any leader that's in that situation where it feels like everything's kind of falling in their lap and not getting done. It is built around what I call the MAX system, and MAX is spelled MAAX. And, we're business people. We love our acronyms. So MAX is management, accounting, but accounting is defined not only the traditional accounting numbers, but what KPIs or metrics are you using to measure your success. Then there's accountability, as we've talked about a lot here. Accountability is the big factor that's often missing. X stands for excellence. Most companies want to create a level of excellence because that's what gets our customers to come back. That's what allows us to grow and allows us to scale. So utilizing those three elements is really where we create the system. And again, it comes to values and behaviors first, and then the systems next. And what I did was I basically created two avatars in the book, going through different situations, because it's very difficult to talk about clients in first person and talking about the good, the bad, and the ugly. So I created two scenarios that I think are pretty realistic for people. You might agree with that as well. There's almost something there that can be relatable to a situation that you're in. And we walk through the process of what MAX does in an organization, where we start, and the fact that it isn't a system-centric process. It is really a people-centric process. And we are still in the world where I don't think the robots have taken over quite yet, and I don't care what other people say. We're still going to need people fixing our cars. We're still going to need people building our houses. People are going to be around for a while. And we also deal with the situation where, and this is why it works well for shops and contractors and things like that, is we have the field and we have the office, or we have different divisions. So there's cross-communication that needs to take place, which most systems assume everyone's under the same roof. And often that, even if you're under the same roof, you're in two completely different areas. So I deal with that where a lot of other books don't really address the difference between what the office needs are versus what the shop needs are, field needs are, and try to communicate that in a clear way to understand where those breakdowns happen and how to overcome.
I had the great fortune to be asked by you to write the foreword to the book. I was able to pre-read the book, and it is a phenomenal book, very easy read, and so much good advice in the book. So I hope that those of you that are out there and maybe struggling with some of this process type stuff, and just in general, any business owner or leader out there that wants to make their systems better and make their business better, this is a fantastic book for that. So I'd encourage you to all go out, find that book, get it in your hands, read it. Dan gave me the hardcover. That was very, very nice of you. It really really cool, and we'll maybe try to get the artwork of the book, picture of the book on the show notes when we release this. But it really, really well done, Dan. You do phenomenal work as always. This book was a reflection of that. So thank you for coming on the show. Best of luck with the book and with your travels that are probably going to come as a result of that. But appreciate all of your help and coming on the podcast and your friendship. It's always a pleasure talking with you.
Well, thank you, Jay. And as always, I've enjoyed working with you and enjoy everything that you're doing here with WrenchWay, and wish you much success as well.
Thank you, buddy.
All right. Take care.
That wraps up another episode of Beyond the Wrench. If you like this episode, please show your support by rating and following the podcast. You can also watch the video interviews on WrenchWay's YouTube channel. Speaking of WrenchWay, Beyond the Wrench is managed and produced by the WrenchWay team. WrenchWay is dedicated to promoting and improving careers in the automotive, diesel, and collision industries. In partnership with ASE, we run the ASE Connects community, which empowers shops and dealerships with reliable data, school connections, and industry insights while helping grow the future technician workforce. You can learn more by visiting wrenchway.com. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next week.